Do you remember those everyday things from the 1980s? The ones so normal then, but shocking through modern eyes now? In that decade, these things shaped school days, family dinners, and weekends without anyone questioning them. How did ordinary life end up looking so outrageous today? Imagine stepping onto a crowded airplane in the 1980s and smelling cigarette smoke before you even sat down. Rows were divided into smoking and non-smoking, but everyone knew that invisible line in the middle row meant nothing. The air was pressurized, the ventilation weak, and by the end of the flight, everyone carried the smell of ash and tobacco in their hair, clothes, and bags. Ashtrays were built into the armrests, tiny metal slots that filled up with butts halfway through a long flight. Flight attendants balanced trays of food while also passing out matches and lighters to passengers who wanted to light up. It was completely normal to see a man settle in with a cigarette in one hand and a cocktail in the other while his neighbor tried to enjoy a meal. Parents smoked with kids sitting right beside them, and no one raised an eyebrow. Complaints were rare because this was just how air travel worked. The haze of smoke blended with the recycled air until it felt heavy in your lungs, but people accepted it as part of the journey. Looking back, it is astonishing that people tolerated smoking inside a flying metal tube filled with hundreds of strangers and limited oxygen. Today, lighting a cigarette on a plane would trigger alarms, fines, and even arrests. Do you remember the sight of glowing cigarette tips dotting a darkened cabin at 30,000 feet? In the 1980s, the phrase, "just a few beers," was used like a free pass. People finished up at a local bar, walked to their cars, and drove home without a second thought. Friends laughed, police often looked the other way unless someone was swerving badly, and it was treated as a routine part of nightlife. Commercials warned against drunk driving, but they felt distant, like they were talking about the real drunks, not the average worker who stopped for a six-pack after his shift. Backyard barbecues ended with neighbors hopping into their cars after a few drinks, their kids riding in the back seat without belts. It was normalized to the point that arguing against it made you sound uptight. Accidents happened often, but the culture framed them as bad luck rather than the obvious outcome of drinking and driving. Only by the late 1980s did campaigns like Mothers Against Drunk Driving start to shift public opinion, making designated driver a common term. Before that, drinking and driving was just another weekend routine. Looking back, it is chilling to realize how casually people risked their own lives and others. Today, even one beer before driving can lead to an arrest or worse, but in the 1980s, just a few was a common excuse. Do you remember when finishing a beer and grabbing the car keys felt like no big deal? On summer weekends in the 1980s, kids piled into the back of pickup trucks like it was the best ride in town. Parents waved from the porch as a truck pulled away, its bed filled with children sitting on the sides, legs dangling, hair flying in the wind. It felt like freedom, a rolling parade float for the neighborhood. There were no seatbelts, no restraints, and no rules. Kids stood up while the truck was moving, bounced on the ridges of the metal bed, or sprawled flat as the wind whipped above them. The faster the truck went, the more thrilling the ride became. Rural highways, dirt roads, or even city streets, it did not matter. The open bed was a playground on wheels. Adults did not see it as dangerous, just part of growing up. In some towns, entire groups of kids rode to Little League games in the back, gloves on their hands, bats sticking up like antennas. It was common at parades, too, with children throwing candy while standing in the back of moving trucks. Today, laws forbid this in most places, and for good reason. But for kids who grew up in that era, the memory of riding through warm summer nights under the open sky remains powerful. Do you remember holding onto the side of a pickup bed as the world raced past? Toy aisles in the 1980s were stocked with BB guns, cap guns, and plastic pistols that looked nearly identical to real weapons. They were painted black, weighted to feel authentic, and often carried proudly by kids playing cops and robbers in the streets. From a distance, there was no way to tell the difference. Children aimed them at each other during backyard battles, chasing through neighborhoods with realistic rifles in their hands. Parents encouraged it, telling their sons it was good practice for learning responsibility. Stores sold them freely, often displayed next to toy soldiers or cowboy sets. The danger was obvious, but society brushed it aside. Police encounters were less tense then, and neighbors rarely called in a man with a gun report when they saw kids running around. For children, the more realistic the toy, the better. Today, toy guns are brightly colored, stamped with orange tips, and regulated heavily to prevent confusion. Looking back, it feels shocking to remember entire groups of kids running through suburban streets holding BB pistols that looked like police weapons. Do you remember gripping a toy gun so real that you felt like a soldier in your own backyard war? The 4th of July in the 1980s was a hands-on holiday for kids. Roadside stands popped up weeks before, selling fireworks directly to children without asking questions. Roman candles, bottle rockets, firecrackers, even M80s, all handed over to 10-year-olds with a smile. Parents gave kids money for fireworks the way they gave money for candy. Brown paper bags filled with explosives were carried home like prized treasures. Children set them off in driveways, alleys, and backyards, often with no adult supervision. Burns and close calls were part of the fun. The culture saw it as tradition. Fireworks were a rite of passage, something you learned by trial and error. If you lost your eyebrows or singed your fingers, that was part of the memory. Few questioned whether selling explosives to kids was wise. Today, strict age limits and regulations control fireworks sales. Looking back, it is startling how casually explosives were handed to children as if they were toys. Do you remember clutching a bag of bottle rockets, eager to light the fuse without a second thought? Station wagons in the 1980s were rolling playgrounds. Children sprawled across the back cargo area like luggage, piled onto each other during road trips, or built forts with pillows and blankets. Seatbelts dangled unused, buried between the cushions. Parents rarely insisted on buckling up, and kids often jumped from seat to seat during the ride. On highways, children slid across the wide vinyl seats as the car turned, shrieking with laughter. For families, road trips were chaotic, noisy, and full of movement. Accidents did happen, but the culture dismissed them as bad luck rather than preventable tragedies. Seatbelt laws were not widely enforced until the late 1980s, so families drove for hours with little thought to safety. Buckling up was for cautious people, not for everyday life. Today, strapping in is second nature, and parents face fines for failing to secure children. Looking back, it is unbelievable how casually families barreled down highways with kids tumbling freely inside the car. Do you remember lying in the back of a station wagon, staring through the rear window at the stars? In the 1980s, parents often left kids home alone overnight without hesitation. A 12-year-old was considered responsible enough to babysit siblings, cook basic meals, and lock up the house. Adults went to parties, overnight trips, or late shifts while kids held down the fort. The rules were simple. Do not open the door, answer the phone only if you know who it is, and call a neighbor if something serious happens. Pizza delivery filled the dinner gap, and television kept kids occupied into the night. For children, being left in charge felt like a milestone of maturity. Risks were real, fires, injuries, or break-ins, but parents trusted their kids in ways that would be unthinkable today. Communities felt safer, and independence was valued more highly. Most kids wore their responsibility like a badge of honor. Today, leaving a child alone overnight can result in legal consequences. Looking back, it is astonishing how normal it was to see preteens babysitting entire households. Do you remember the thrill of being the one in charge, even if you were only 12? In the 1980s, cigarette vending machines were as common as soda machines. They stood in diners, bowling alleys, and even grocery stores. For the price of a few quarters, anyone, adult or child, could pull a lever and walk away with a pack of Marlboros or Camels. Teenagers bought cigarettes openly, often laughing as they fed coins into the machines while adults looked on without concern. The machines lit up, humming quietly, and dropped packs into the tray with a satisfying thud. No ID, no questions, just access. Tobacco companies knew exactly what they were doing, placing machines in places kids already gathered. Even non-smokers grew up familiar with the sight. considering it no more unusual than a candy machine. By the 1990s, regulations cracked down, removing vending machines from most public places. Looking back, it is startling that addictive products were sold this way with no restrictions. Do you remember the sound of that lever clanking as a fresh pack dropped into your hand? Walk down a school hallway in the 1980s, and you might catch a whiff of cigarette smoke drifting from the faculty lounge. Teachers gathered between classes, sipping coffee and puffing away while papers piled on their desks. The haze of smoke seeped into the hallways, mixing with the smell of chalk dust and floor wax. Students knew exactly where the lounge was. Passing by meant walking through a wall of secondhand smoke as voices and laughter spilled from the door. It was a symbol of adulthood, a place where authority figures acted like anyone else. Parents accepted it as normal, and schools made no effort to hide it. Ashtrays overflowed, and nobody questioned whether it was appropriate. Teachers who scolded kids for bad habits often returned to the lounge to light up themselves. Today, the idea of teachers smoking inside schools is unimaginable. Looking back, it feels surreal that education and cigarette smoke once coexisted under the same roof. Do you remember the faint smell of tobacco that clung to teachers' clothes during afternoon lessons? Every corner store in the 1980s had boxes of candy cigarettes on the shelf. White sugar sticks with red tips, they were sold to children as a treat that mimicked the look of real cigarettes. Kids bought them with pocket change and strutted around pretending to smoke. The candy came in boxes designed to look like real cigarette brands, complete with logos and packaging styles. Children tapped the boxes against their hands, pulled out the sticks, and puffed imaginary smoke clouds at each other. It was marketed as innocent fun, but clearly trained kids to copy adult habits. Parents thought it was harmless, even cute. Some even laughed when their children posed with candy between their lips. The connection between candy and cigarettes was obvious, but the culture ignored it. Today, the idea of selling candy that imitates cigarettes to children would cause outrage. Looking back, it is wild that entire generations grew up practicing smoking with sugar sticks. Do you remember tearing open a box and pretending to be just like the adults around you? In the 1980s, playgrounds were built with toughness in mind, not safety. Swings, monkey bars, and towering metal slides stood proudly above solid asphalt or concrete. When you fell, and every kid did, the impact left scraped knees, elbows, or sometimes even a trip to the hospital. But nobody thought twice about it. The blacktop surface doubled as a basketball court, so playgrounds were a mix of games, fights, and accidents waiting to happen. Metal slides baked in the sun until they could practically brand bare legs. Merry-go-rounds spun wildly, tossing kids onto the pavement while teachers looked on with little concern. Parents shrugged it off as part of growing up. Bruises, cuts, and even broken bones were considered the price of fun. Recess meant risk, and most kids went home proudly displaying battle scars as proof they had played hard. Today, soft padding, wood chips, or rubber mats cover playgrounds. Looking back, it is shocking that an entire generation was sent to play on what was basically a paved parking lot filled with steel equipment. Do you remember the sting of asphalt burns as you jumped off the swings at full speed? For kids in the 1980s, a bike was pure freedom. But helmets, reflectors, or safety lights, those were almost unheard of. Children tore down steep hills, raced through neighborhoods, and cut across busy streets with nothing but hope keeping them safe. Scraped knees and gravel rash were daily badges of honor. Wheelies, skids, and daring jumps off curbs were the norm. Some kids even rode double, balancing a friend on the handlebars or pegs. The risks were obvious, but the thrill outweighed them every time. Parents rarely insisted on helmets. In fact, most kids would have laughed at the idea, considering it something for professionals or motocross racers. Night rides were done by moonlight, with kids weaving through dark streets until dinner time. Today, bike helmets are not only encouraged but often legally required. Looking back, it is incredible how casually children were sent flying down hills without protection. Do you remember the rush of bombing down a hill? No lights, no helmet, just the wind in your face? In the 1980s, soda machines stood proudly in school hallways, buzzing quietly between classes. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Mountain Dew, bright cans of sugar and caffeine available to any kid with spare change. Teachers used them too, and nobody questioned whether soda belonged in schools. Children lined up at lunch to grab an ice-cold can, gulping fizzy sweetness before heading back to math or gym. Mountain Dew at 10 a.m., Dr. Pepper at noon. It was considered normal fuel for the day. The machines were a symbol of status, glowing with temptation just steps from classrooms. Parents rarely complained because soda was woven into daily life. Schools profited from the machines, funding field trips and sports teams with the proceeds. Sugar highs filled classrooms, followed by inevitable crashes, but teachers accepted it as part of the chaos. Today, soda machines have been replaced with bottled water or juice, banned in most schools by health regulations. Looking back, it is astonishing that children once guzzled caffeinated soda during class breaks. Do you remember the clunk of a can dropping, promising a sugar rush that carried you through the afternoon? In the 1980s, peanut butter was everywhere in school cafeterias. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were served daily, peanut butter crackers filled vending machines, and peanut butter desserts sat on bake sale tables. No allergy warnings, no labels, just peanut butter as a universal staple. Teachers handed out peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to kids who forgot their lunches, cafeterias stacked trays of sandwiches, and nobody thought to ask about allergies. It was assumed that every child could eat it, and most parents considered it healthy, protein-packed fuel for the school day. Children traded sandwiches across tables, swapped halves, or ate peanut butter straight from little packets. It was cheap, filling, and so common that few school days passed without it. Today, schools ban peanuts entirely, with strict guidelines and allergy awareness campaigns. Looking back, it is startling to think how casually something deadly to some children was served daily. Do you remember unwrapping yet another peanut butter and jelly, not knowing it would later be one of the most restricted foods in schools? The 1980s were an era when kids' chemistry sets contained real chemicals, acids, powders, and glass tubes. Children mixed volatile substances at kitchen tables, striking matches over experiments that fizzed, smoked, and sometimes exploded. Parents considered it educational, not dangerous. The sets came with warnings, but few read them, trusting children to be careful. Kids melted plastic toys, stained counters, and burned fingers, all in the name of science. The thrill was unmatched. Lighting a Bunsen burner or mixing random powders gave kids the sense they were scientists or alchemists in their own homes. Safety goggles were rare, and supervision even rarer. Today's chemistry kits are watered down, filled with harmless substitutes and strict instructions. Looking back, it is amazing how freely children once handled hazardous materials. Do you remember the sharp smell of sulfur drifting through the house from one of those experiments? County fairs in the 1980s often rolled into town on the back of flatbed trucks. Rusty rides were bolted together overnight by crews who looked more like drifters than engineers. By morning, the Ferris wheel was spinning, the tilt-a-whirl was rattling, and kids lined up with tickets in hand. Parents did not ask about safety inspections. They trusted the carnival workers, even as rides shook, squealed, and wobbled. Loose bolts, chipped paint, and makeshift repairs were common sights. Kids loved every minute. The more dangerous it felt, the better the ride seemed. Friends dared each other to go on the wildest, fastest attractions, screaming as the machinery clanked around them. Today, ride inspections are rigorous, and safety is heavily enforced. Looking back, it is shocking how many families once trusted rides assembled in a single night. Do you remember holding your breath as the Ferris wheel swayed in the wind, wondering if it would hold? Public pools in the 1980s often posted a simple sign: "Swim at your own risk." Children dove, splashed, and played with no lifeguard in sight. Parents dropped them off for the day, confident the kids would manage on their own. Roughhousing was common. Games of chicken, dives from unsafe heights, and underwater breath-holding contests filled summer afternoons. Kids dared each other to swim the length of the pool without coming up for air, while others leapt from the highest points of fences or ledges just to make a bigger splash. It was chaotic, sometimes reckless. But nobody thought of it as unusual. If accidents happened, older kids or nearby adults jumped in to help. The absence of authority felt like freedom. Pools were loud, chaotic, and sometimes dangerous, but that was accepted as part of summer. Today, liability laws make unsupervised pools almost unheard of. Looking back, it is jarring to remember children swimming in deep water without trained staff nearby. Do you remember plunging into the pool, fully aware no lifeguard was watching? On hot afternoons in the 1980s, kids quenched their thirst straight from the garden hose. The water was warm at first, tinged with a rubbery taste, but nobody minded. Friends lined up in driveways, passing the hose from mouth to mouth. Parents encouraged it, telling kids to drink outside rather than track dirt into the kitchen. No cups, no filters, no worries, just hose water gulped between games of tag or backyard baseball. Sometimes the hose sprayed everyone before the water was under control, sparking laughter as kids soaked each other before drinking. Even the dog joined in, lapping at the stream alongside the children. It was considered a rite of passage, a shared memory of summer. The first cool rush after the hot water cleared was enough to keep kids running back. Today, concerns about bacteria, lead, and plastics have all but ended the practice. Looking back, it is incredible how normal it once was to drink from a hose. Do you remember the distinct taste of sun-warmed hose water on a sweltering day? Family refrigerators in the 1980s often held one milk carton that everyone knew was the backwash carton. Brothers, sisters, and even parents tilted it back, drinking straight from the spout before putting it back on the shelf. No one thought it was gross, it was just efficient. Glasses meant extra dishes, and kids were in too much of a hurry to pour. Sometimes whole families argued over who left floaties behind, but the truth was that everyone had taken a swig at some point. It became a kind of unspoken household rule. If you were thirsty, you grabbed the carton, no questions asked. Arguments erupted when someone left the carton nearly empty, but the habit stuck in almost every household. Parents rolled their eyes, but rarely enforced rules against it. Today, the idea of sharing milk this way feels unsanitary. Looking back, it is funny how many families accepted the backwash carton as part of daily life. Do you remember sneaking a swig of milk, hoping nobody caught you? In the 1980s, soda cans were often sealed with lead solder. The toxic metal touched the beverage directly, but at the time, nobody considered it dangerous. Kids and adults alike drank gallons of soda from cans every year. The cans were heavy, metallic, and prone to sharp edges that cut fingers when opened. Recycling was rare, so cans piled up in trash bags at barbecues and birthday parties. Some kids even collected the cans, stacking them into towers or crushing them under their sneakers, never realizing the danger lurking in the design. The metallic taste that clung to each sip was dismissed as normal, a flavor everyone grew up with. Despite health risks, the convenience of cans outweighed any concerns. Parents happily stocked garages and fridges with cases of soda, never thinking twice about lead exposure. Today, the practice has been banned, replaced with safer sealing methods. Looking back, it is shocking how casually toxic materials were part of everyday life. Do you remember popping open a can, the metallic taste mixing with cola? In the 1980s, public payphones were lifelines. They stood on busy corners, gas stations, malls, and airports, rows of metal booths with dangling cords and receivers touched by thousands of hands. No sanitizer, no wipes, no worries. You picked up the grimy receiver, pressed it to your ear, and hoped you could hear over the static. Every surface was coated in fingerprints, gum residue, and the faint stickiness of soda spills. Coins rattled as people dropped them into the slot, some jamming buttons with dirty fingers while shouting into the receiver. The earpiece often smelled faintly of smoke or perfume, carrying the invisible trace of whoever had just finished their call. Children used payphones too, lifting heavy receivers that were almost bigger than their heads. Teenagers called parents for rides after movies, huddling inside booths to avoid the wind, while travelers dialed long-distance numbers without thinking about who had touched the phone before them. Nobody questioned hygiene, because germs simply were not part of the cultural conversation. The phones themselves became symbols of community. People waited in line for their turn, often overhearing half of someone else's story. Others pressed buttons repeatedly, hoping to snag a free call when the machine jammed. The phone book chained below the booth was tattered, pages curled with moisture, but still thumbed through daily. Today, with cell phones in every pocket and sanitizer bottles everywhere, the idea of pressing a stranger's phone against your face feels unthinkable. Looking back, it is amazing how normal it was to share such an intimate object with countless strangers. Do you remember the cold metal feel of a payphone receiver pressed against your ear as the world rushed by around you? Bake sales in the 1980s were simple affairs. Parents and students filled folding tables with brownies, cupcakes, fudge, and cookies wrapped in plastic wrap or tucked into wax paper. Prices were low, 25 cents for a brownie, maybe 50 cents for a cupcake, and kids lined up with quarters jingling in their pockets. There were no ingredient labels. Nobody knew if a treat contained peanuts, eggs, or anything else that could be deadly to a child with allergies. But allergies were rarely discussed then, and most people assumed kids could eat anything. Peanut butter squares, nut-covered fudge, and mystery brownies sat right beside sugar cookies without any distinction. Teachers encouraged kids to buy more, reminding them the money-funded field trips, sports uniforms, or playground equipment. Children traded desserts across tables, boasting about which family's brownies were the richest or whose cookies had the biggest chocolate chips. Parents often sent their children to school with Tupperware containers stacked with homemade treats, proud to contribute to the event. The excitement of the bake sale was less about the food itself and more about the sense of abundance. Tables groaned under the weight of desserts, and kids left with sticky fingers and frosting on their faces. Nobody thought twice about sanitation, storage, or foodborne illness. Today, bake sales are rare, and when they happen, strict rules apply. Store-bought items with ingredient lists are often required. Homemade goods frowned upon. Looking back, it feels astonishing that entire cafeterias once feasted on unlabeled, unregulated food. Do you remember biting into a brownie at a school bake sale, never questioning what was inside? Step into a roller rink in the 1980s, and you were stepping into chaos. The neon lights reflected off disco balls, music thumped from giant speakers, and the rink floor filled with kids skating fast, spinning, and crashing, all without a single helmet, knee pad, or elbow guard in sight. Falling was part of the experience. Kids went down hard on wooden floors, smacking knees and elbows, then scrambled up before the next skater plowed into them. The sound of wheels clattering, people laughing, and the occasional loud crash filled the rink. Injuries were common, but nobody expected anything different. Parents dropped kids off at rinks for entire evenings, trusting them to stay out of trouble. Teenagers showed off, weaving in and out of the crowd, sometimes forming trains of linked arms that snaked dangerously across the floor. The occasional sprained wrist or broken bone was shrugged off as part of skating life. Rentals added to the risk. Worn-out skates with frayed laces and uneven wheels were handed out to kids by the hundreds. They slipped them on, tied them loosely, and took off without hesitation. The rink itself was often dimly lit, making falls even harder to avoid. Today, skating culture has shifted towards safety, with gear often required in public spaces. Looking back, it is unbelievable how casually children and teens risked serious injury for a night of fun. Do you remember flying around a roller rink with the music pounding, hoping you would not wipe out on the next turn? Halloween in the 1980s was pure excess. Children ran from house to house, filling pillowcases and plastic pumpkins with candy until they could hardly carry them. When they returned home, they dumped the piles onto the floor and immediately dug in. Parents rarely inspected the candy. Safety checks were not part of the routine. Apples, homemade popcorn balls, cookies, and fudge were handed out alongside factory-wrapped candy bars. Neighbors gave out treats they had made in their kitchens, and children ate them without hesitation. The idea of poisoned or tampered candy floated in rumors, but most families dismissed it as myth. Children compared hauls, trading candies, and bragging about who had the biggest stash. Sticky fingers reached into bowls for Tootsie Rolls, candy corn, and licorice. Nobody stopped to ask where the food had come from or whether it was safe. Parents considered Halloween a night of freedom. They trusted their neighbors, and the community spirit was stronger than fear. Kids gorged on sweets late into the night, their mouths dyed red, blue, and green by artificial dyes. Today, parents carefully inspect every piece, discarding anything unwrapped or suspicious. Many communities even host safe trick-or-treat events at malls or schools. Looking back, it is remarkable how freely children once ate whatever landed in their bags. Do you remember the joy of tearing into your candy haul the moment you got home, without a single adult telling you to wait? In the 1980s, Halloween lasted as long as kids could keep walking. Groups of children roamed neighborhoods until midnight, wandering miles from home with no adults in sight. Parents stayed behind to hand out candy, trusting their kids to return when they were finished. The night air was filled with laughter, shouts, and the sound of footsteps running from one house to the next. Kids carried pillowcases instead of plastic pumpkins because a pillowcase could hold far more candy. They crossed busy streets, ventured into unfamiliar neighborhoods, and went wherever the candy trail led them. Older kids played pranks, covering houses with toilet paper, spraying shaving cream, or smashing pumpkins, while younger children soldiered on with their candy quest. The streets belonged to kids, and adults barely noticed unless something serious happened. The thrill of staying out so late was part of the holiday. Children felt independent, brave, and adventurous, walking home under the glow of streetlights with bags full of sugar. Parents might peek out the window near midnight, but they rarely worried. Today, trick-or-treating often ends by 8 p.m., with parents close by and flashlights in hand. Communities shorten the hours for safety, and children rarely wander far from home. Looking back, it is astonishing how much freedom kids once had. Do you remember trudging home with sore feet and a candy haul so heavy it nearly ripped your pillowcase open? In the 1980s, bikes were freedom, and helmets were practically unheard of. Kids flew down steep hills, popped wheelies in the street, and raced through traffic with the wind in their faces and no protection at all. A crash meant a scraped knee, not a trip to the emergency room. Parents rarely insisted on safety gear. Helmets were for motocross racers or kids with overly cautious parents, not for the everyday rider. Packs of children roamed neighborhoods like little gangs on wheels, daring each other to go faster, higher, or farther. Sometimes kids tied ropes to their bikes and dragged friends on skateboards or roller skates, laughing until someone wiped out. Gravel-strewn streets tore into bare knees, leaving scars that became badges of honor. Even when crashes ended in tears, kids were back on their bikes the very next day. Crashes were inevitable. Kids went over handlebars, skidded across gravel, and sometimes limped home with torn clothes and bloody elbows. But it was part of the adventure, a badge of honor to show up the next day with bandages and stories. Today, helmets and reflectors are mandatory in most places, and parents would never dream of letting kids ride unprotected. Looking back, it is shocking how casually kids once flew through neighborhoods with nothing but hope keeping them safe. Do you remember bombing down a hill? No helmet, no lights, just the rush of speed? The canoe rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with one foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. Masters of the Universe was the first time kids got a full-blown animated saga wrapped around their plastic heroes. It was a marketing masterstroke, a show designed to sell toys that actually made you believe in the characters. Skeletor, Tila, Orko. They were not just sidekicks or enemies. They were your childhood companions. Every after-school episode felt like an adventure. You learned courage, honor, even self-worth, all before dinner. These were not simple toys. They were world builders. Your bedroom floor became Eternia, and your imagination had no limits. But eventually, they made way for flashier franchises, newer tech, and shinier packaging. He-Man was packed up in boxes, left behind with broken swords and dusty armor. But his impact never really faded. For one golden stretch of years, kids were the authors of epic tales, not just the audience. And in those stories, anything felt possible. Why did we stop handing power to the people? In the mid-1980s, milk cartons became a chilling part of breakfast. Alongside your cereal, you stared at photos of missing children printed on the side. Families poured milk over their Cheerios while scanning the faces of kids who had vanished, hoping someone might recognize them. It was one of the first national awareness campaigns for child abductions. Parents talked about it at breakfast tables, and kids grew up with the unsettling reminder that children just like them could disappear. Some families clipped the photos and kept them by the phone just in case. For kids, it was confusing. One moment you were eating cornflakes, the next you were staring at the smiling face of a child labeled missing. It blended the innocence of breakfast with the fear of real-world dangers. Today, awareness campaigns live online or through Amber Alerts, but the milk carton photos are remembered as stark symbols of the 1980s. Looking back, it is haunting how something as simple as breakfast carried such heavy reminders. Do you remember sitting at the table, wondering what had happened to the faces staring back at you from the carton? The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. Limited access to cable television in the 1980s meant your world came through rabbit ears. You had the basics, network channels, maybe a grainy local station or two. But when friends talked about Nickelodeon, MTV, or the Disney Channel, you just smiled and nodded, pretending you knew what they meant. Your TV had an antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. Your Saturday mornings were for cartoons on the few channels that came in clear. You learned to adjust the rabbit ears just right, then sit perfectly still, because moving even an inch might send the screen back into static. You missed out on the cable-exclusive shows, the big movie nights, the flashy channels with round-the-clock music videos. You got public access, reruns, and news that ended with the national anthem. At school, you heard about shows you never saw. You laughed along anyway. At home, you made the most of what you had. Limited channels meant fewer choices, but also fewer arguments. You watched whatever was on. You made it work. And you learned something strange. When there was only one option, it often became your favorite. The picture was not perfect, but it was yours. And sometimes, that was enough. It was small, square, and maddening. The Rubik's Cube took over the 1980s like a brainy little virus, impossible to solve, harder to put down. Originally invented in Hungary in the 1970s, it exploded into the United States like intellectual wildfire. Every school desk had one, every locker, every coffee table, and everyone thought they could beat it until they tried. It was not just a toy, it was a statement, a challenge, a social flex. Can you solve it? Was the question of the year. And if you could, you were royalty. Kids timed themselves, adults pretended not to be frustrated, and puzzle competitions became legitimate televised events. There was something deeper going on too. It was the Cold War, the space race, the computer age, and the Rubik's Cube fit right in. Order from chaos, logic over emotion. It felt futuristic, clean, brilliant. Then, slowly, it vanished from center stage. Too hard, too humbling, too analog. But those colorful little squares still sit in drawers, waiting to remind us of the strange joy in solving something impossible. Sometimes you do not need a screen. You just need 6 sides and a little bit of patience. Public pools in the 1980s often operated with a simple sign, "Swim at your own risk." Parents dropped kids off with towels and snacks, confident they would manage the day without supervision. Children cannonballed into deep ends, raced each other across lanes, and roughhoused on diving boards without a lifeguard watching. If something went wrong, older kids or nearby adults jumped in to help. It was chaotic, but everyone accepted the risk. Games like who can hold their breath the longest often turned dangerous, but no one intervened unless something looked serious. Diving boards launched kids into the water without spotters, leading to more than a few belly flops and collisions. Snack bars sold sodas and candy, fueling the wild energy of a pool packed with unsupervised children. The absence of authority felt like freedom. Pools were noisy, splash-filled, and sometimes dangerous, but they were the centerpiece of summer. The smell of chlorine and the sound of laughter were enough to keep kids coming back day after day. Today, liability laws make unsupervised pools nearly impossible. Looking back, it is amazing how casually families treated water safety. Do you remember plunging into the pool, fully aware no lifeguard was on duty? The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout, then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the go-kart track that somehow never got shut down. Furniture from thrift stores or curbside finds gave homes that mismatched charm only necessity could create. A sagging couch from someone else's garage sale. A wobbly coffee table rescued from the sidewalk. Chairs with mismatched legs or beds with slats that creaked under every turn. This was what made a living room feel lived in. There was no delivery truck, just a neighbor with a pickup, or a slow push down the block with a dolly borrowed from Uncle Joe. You sprayed it down, you wiped it twice, and you made it yours. Some pieces were covered in throws to hide the rips. Others leaned against the wall to stay upright. But they had character, stories, a past you never asked about. In kitchens, the table might have a burn mark or a dent from years of use, but it still held dinner. In bedrooms, dressers groaned when you pulled the drawers, but they closed eventually. New furniture was for people with money. For everyone else, you took what you could get, and you were thankful for it. Because when money was tight, having something, anything, to sit on was a win. You did not care how it looked. You cared that it worked. It was just a little old lady with a giant bun and a tiny hamburger patty. But in 1984, Clara Peller said 3 words that would shake the advertising world to its core. "Where's the beef?" she shouted, eyes narrowed, voice sharp. And suddenly the entire country could not stop repeating it. Wendy's had hit gold. This was not just a commercial. It was a cultural earthquake. It was parodied on late-night television, referenced in presidential campaigns, and printed on bumper stickers coast to coast. People were not just buying hamburgers. They were buying attitude. The ad turned fast food into theater and customers into critics. It questioned everything: value, honesty, expectations. And it did it in under 30 seconds. For a moment in time, a 3-word punchline became the nation's conscience. Then it faded, as all catchphrases do. But the genius of it stuck. We live in an era drowning in marketing, and still, no one ever quite topped Clara's gravelly challenge. The line is funny, sure, but it is also something more. It is a demand, a standard, a dare. In a world of hollow promises, maybe we are all still asking, where is the beef? In the 1980s, parents thought nothing of leaving kids home alone for hours. The only safety net was an emergency number written on the fridge, usually a neighbor, a relative, or the police station. Kids were told to lock the doors, stay inside, and maybe order a pizza if they got hungry. There were no cell phones, no text check-ins, and no quick ways to reach parents. If something went wrong, kids had to walk to a payphone or hope the house phone still worked. In most cases, nothing happened, and parents came home to find kids watching television or sprawled on the floor with toys. It was a rite of passage to be trusted at home alone. Younger kids bragged about it, while older siblings carried the heavy responsibility of babysitting for an entire evening. Sometimes things went wrong, a burnt dinner, a broken lamp, or a power outage, but those moments were shrugged off as part of growing up. Today, leaving children alone without constant phone contact can even lead to legal trouble. Looking back, it is astonishing how much independence parents once handed to their kids without hesitation. Do you remember sitting in a quiet house, the only lifeline being a phone number taped to the fridge? The Dented Can discount grocery store was the kind of place you never admitted shopping at, unless you were Dad. Then it was a badge of honor. You did not bring a list here. You brought instincts. Aisles of unlabeled tins, faded labels, and cardboard signs scribbled in permanent marker, 10 cans for $1. What cans? Who knew? Dad would hold one up and say, "Beef chunks and gravy." Sounds promising, like he was about to enter it in a cooking competition. Most of the time it was mystery meat roulette, but we were not there for the menu. We were there for the thrill. He treated the whole store like an auction. "Name brand beans. Get them while they last," he would whisper, like a man uncovering buried treasure. At checkout, he would proudly announce how much he saved, never mind the fact that dinner might be spaghetti and something we would call tomato adjacent. You learned to laugh, to try everything once, and to realize a meal made on the cheap still meant you had one. But for a different kind of treasure, tucked away in someone's garage, let me tell you about the model train shop that made time stand still. Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. They were young, they were messy, and they looked just like us. The Brat Pack were not heroes or superheroes. They were teenagers who felt everything too hard and said it out loud. When you watched The Breakfast Club, it was not a movie. It was a mirror. These kids, Molly Ringwald, Emilio Estevez, Ali Sheedy, Anthony Michael Hall, they were your classmates, your crush, your quiet friend who wrote poems in the back of her notebook. They showed us that being misunderstood was not weakness. It was the most honest thing in the world. And America listened. These films made teenagers visible in a way no generation had done before. It was all there. The loneliness, the rebellion, the awkward crushes and silent pain. The Brat Pack did not just make films. They captured youth itself, wild and raw and unforgettable. They came, they burned, and then they vanished. The fame faded. The faces grew up. But the emotions, they still hit like a first heartbreak. In a world of curated youth and perfect filters, we forget what it felt like to be truly, painfully real. And maybe that is why those faces still haunt us in the best way. Before cell phones, payphones were everywhere in the 1980s. They stood on busy streets, in gas stations, at malls, and outside grocery stores, metal booths with grimy receivers that thousands of strangers had pressed to their ears. Dropping a quarter into the slot was the sound of connection. Kids used them to call parents for rides, teenagers called friends late at night, and adults lined up in airports to make long-distance calls home. Phone books hung from chains, their pages curled and worn, offering every number you needed. Receivers were sticky from constant use, and many smelled faintly of cigarettes or perfume. Some booths were covered in graffiti, etched with initials or phone numbers passed around like secrets. Kids often dared each other to prank call strangers, racing out of the booth before anyone could catch them. The booths themselves became symbols of everyday life. People ducked inside during rainstorms, cupping the receiver to block the noise of traffic. Sometimes kids prank-called strangers, laughing as they ran away before the operator could trace it. Today, payphones are almost extinct, relics of another time. Looking back, it is strange to think of how public and communal making a phone call once was. Do you remember the cold feel of the receiver and the smell of cigarette smoke as you tried to make a call in a noisy booth? It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range, while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store." Homemade school lunches in washed-out containers were the unofficial lunchbox of every frugal family. Forget the cartoon thermos or the shiny metal lunch pail. If you were poor in the 1980s, your sandwich came wrapped in wax paper and packed in an empty margarine tub. Maybe the lid said country crock, but inside was leftover spaghetti or peanut butter crackers. You used the same container every day. The label peeled, the edges warped, but it worked. Your drink? Not a juice box. Maybe a reused jelly jar with watered-down Kool-Aid. You prayed it did not leak. In the lunchroom, you sat next to kids with perfectly packed snacks, cheese sticks, pudding cups, chips with real logos. You ate quietly, or fast, or not at all. But at home, it made sense. Those containers stacked neatly in the cupboard. Your parents washed them each night and packed them again with care. It was not about shame. It was about stretching every cent. And even though you knew it was different, you also knew it was made with effort, maybe even love. Those stained lids and handwritten notes stuffed under the sandwich were signs of sacrifice. And now, all grown up, they feel like something you miss. Before tablets, before streaming, before every show on earth was one click away, there was only one place to be on a Saturday morning. In front of the television, cereal in hand, pajamas still warm from bed. The screen would light up with the thunder of Thundercats, the roar of He-Man, the transforming crash of Autobots. These were not just cartoons. They were our best friends, our imaginary adventures, our emotional security blankets. For 2 golden hours, the world made sense. You cheered, laughed, and learned the kind of values that grown-ups forgot to teach: justice, teamwork, heroism, and most of all, fun. These shows were loud, animated love letters to a generation who needed a break from reality. And when the credits rolled and your mom called you to get dressed, it was like waking up from a dream. The ritual was so sacred, networks competed with one another like gladiators for your sleepy-eyed loyalty. Then, quietly, it all faded. Saturday morning cartoons disappeared, replaced by talk shows and infomercials. Now, we watch on demand, anytime we want. But it is not the same, because we did not just watch those shows, we waited for them. And in the waiting, we found something real. Cars in the 1980s came standard with ashtrays and built-in cigarette lighters. Smoking while driving was so common that it was expected, and every family car carried the smell of tobacco in its seats and upholstery. Parents lit cigarettes with kids in the back seat, the windows rolled up, smoke swirling in the air. Ashtrays filled with butts during long road trips, and the faint glow of a lit cigarette was as familiar as the radio playing classic rock. Nobody thought twice about it. Some kids pressed the cigarette lighter just to watch the red coil glow, branding holes into car mats or even seats. Ashtrays often overflowed, with ashes spilling into cup holders and onto the floor. Even the smell of a brand new car quickly disappeared under layers of stale smoke. Even non-smokers grew accustomed to the smell. Friends piled into cars and accepted that a ride meant breathing in a haze of tobacco. The cigarette lighter itself doubled as a toy for curious kids who sometimes burned holes in upholstery with its red-hot coil. Today, the idea of smoking in a car with children inside is shocking, even illegal in some places. Looking back, it is incredible how normalized it once was. Do you remember the glowing tip of a cigarette lighting up a dark car ride at night? The Oddball Roadside Museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway, "Come see the world's largest pencil," or "America's first toaster still works." Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states, a whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles, a two-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. We have just relived the everyday moments from the 1980s that feel shocking now. So share in the comments which one you remember most vividly, tap like if it brought back a memory, and subscribe to join us on the next trip through time.